Here from Australia, many of you know that they won the international tournament in Ankara, Turkey. This is very exciting. Some of you have probably watched that round. They're here to talk to us about debate. Specifically, they're going to be talking to us about a question that a lot of you have been asking about. How do we find the debate? How do we know what's a good way when you're in prep time to actually get at the topic? So we'll talk about that a little bit and then open it up for Q&A. And you guys don't have to keep your Q&A to that topic. You can broaden it beyond that too. All right?
So, really quickly, I don't think we need to even say how awesome of an opportunity this is, so be thinking of Q&A, King students. Think of good, deep questions for them to answer. But
sure, and just like if you have any question at any time, just shoot your hand up. Because there will be things that Steve and I will say, like, there's things that don't make sense to Steve or I when we say. So it's more than likely that that you might not understand something we say at any particular moment. So with respect to the first of these questions, which is finding the debate, one of the things that perhaps we certainly would have emphasised on the weekend, if you encountered it as Steve or I as an adjudicator, was particularly for opening government teams, but actually for all teams in a debate, that one of the things you have to identify is the key clash, or the key conceptual division that the debate is getting at. And in lots of, I mean, there's probably actually only 15 or 20 different types of debates, and there's just different iterations of the same key conceptual clash. So it might be sort of trading off civil liberties for national security, or economic growth, or sort of facilitating economic rights at the expense of equality. That might be the key conceptual clash of a whole range of different debates. So perhaps the best thing to do here is to almost like take apart a couple of different motions and look at how you might sort of enter finding the clash from that particular perspective. But Steve, if you have any...
Yeah, I reckon that, I think, yeah, we should definitely do that. I think when you get the topic, like the most basic question to ask yourself is just like, why was this topic set? And you want to give, I guess, like the debating relevant answer, not like the cynical answer, you know, like because the chief adjudicator is incompetent, or because the chief adjudicator wanted to screw with us. So, like, why has this topic been set? What is happening in the world, or in the, the sphere of policy debate in the world that has meant that this is relevant? And that's like the first thing that will set you off on your inquiry. I think the second thing then is when you get a motion that you might not know as much about, so you can't instantly look at the debate and say, here's what we're being asked to defend or being asked to propose. One of the things that's really useful is just to brainstorm with your partner as much just description of the status quo as you can. So, in other words, like, if the topic is, say, that the government should ban private education, that's like not a very difficult topic. But say you were like unsure as to what exactly that debate was getting at. A really useful thing to do would just be to sit down and flesh out with your partner as much detail about how the education system works as you can. Ask yourself questions like, how do we organise our system of schools? What are the purposes of education? Who are the important stakeholders in education? And hopefully by doing all of that, you can kind of like, dredge up enough knowledge that you already have to give yourself like a pretty strong foundation to start making some more educated guesses about where the debate's supposed to go.
Yeah, I think this point about stakeholders is actually like an incredibly easy way in which to work out the debate. Because often you can ask yourself, like, so when we use the phrase stakeholders, people know what we mean.
Question mark?
Yes?
Yeah. Okay, so stakeholder is just, like, I guess, like debating jargon for like a group in the debate. So, if you were talking about education, like students are a stakeholder, teachers are a stakeholder, school administrators are stakeholders, the government is a stakeholder. Yeah.
So it's just, I guess, any group whom the debate affects, or whom the issue affects, for better or worse. One of the key ways in which you can find the clash in the debate and the sort of the conceptual framework of debate is to ask yourself, like, for which stakeholder is this best, and for which is it worst? And you can almost sort of divine that the competing interests of the person for whom it's best and the person for whom it's worse is actually like the debate. Whether or not we sort of prioritize the rights of these particular people above these particular people. So in any sort of debate about like criminal procedure, or take the debate that was done on the weekend about the exclusionary rule, it was removing the exclusionary rule from, or it was removing the exclusionary rule from all trials. You might say that like that is probably in the victims of these crimes' interest, but not in the perpetrator of these crimes' interest. So it's a question of like whether our prioritization of law enforcement should trump the rights of, like, trump the civil rights of every criminal and citizen.
So let's start with a topic. I'm like thinking of a pretty good one, just because it is like, I guess, a bit left field, and hopefully will be a bit instructive in trying to figure out what you're being asked to argue. So this was a topic at Sydney Mini last year, which is like the Australian BP Championships that Sydney holds. And the motion was, this House would prosecute poachers as first-degree murderers. You know, as an aside, that is obviously like a pretty stupid topic, because poachers are not committing first-degree murder, like almost by definition. So it's actually in many ways a really good way to try and like think about how you would react if you're the opening government there. Because I guess the first step is like to put aside, to kind of suspend your disbelief. And turn off the impulse that says, like, well, this is obviously never going to happen, and it's like an exercise in sophistry to debate about it. So, the first thing that you want to do there is like ask yourself, why would this topic have been set? Does anyone like want to have like a guess? I mean, like what? Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Perhaps equating human and animals is kind of on the same moral plane, maybe.
Yep. Definitely. And I think that's like one of the arguments you're being asked to make. What other, like, I guess, policy issues might inspire this topic? Yeah.
Has there been an increase in poaching recently?
Maybe. I don't know. But that's basically it, right? I mean, you kind of, the two things the debate is getting at is like, obviously it implies that poaching is a problem, whether because it's increasing or just the current amount of poaching is a problem. And then it's asking you to defend some level of equivalence between the taking of an animal life and the taking of a human life, and that's like exactly what you do as a starting point. But let's go with that kind of that strategy of just like fleshing out the facts related to the debate. So you might start asking yourself questions like, okay, if we're talking about poaching here, in which countries might poaching be a problem? What types of animals are poached? Who are likely to be the poachers of those animals? Why is it that they become poachers of animals? What do they do with the animals or the animal products that they get by engaging in that poaching? So what you're doing there is like building up this kind of like thatchwork of characterization that leads you then obviously to like the next question you're going to ask yourself, which is like, now that we've thought about all of this stuff, how can we relate this to murder? And why can we start thinking of reasons why it deserves the same sanction from the state as murder?
Yeah, just to deviate away from this in an applied sense, I think what is really useful here is that like one of the things that people forget about in debating is that the process of preparation is very much just about asking the right questions, even before you get to an answer. So like in administrative law, there's like a whole area of law that it looks at whether or not judges or decision makers asked the right question in making a decision or a determination. And I think it's a really useful concept to apply to debating. In that, we see too many teams who, after a debate, might be like, I just couldn't think of that in prep. But then just by asking like a simple question, which logically flowed from the topic, they were able to come up with like lots and lots of different arguments within that particular issue. But the most, and this is the second point that I want to make, the most important question you can ask yourself generally in any debate, perhaps even before you get to the stakeholders, is just what is the problem and what is it about our solution that will solve that problem? If you get that right, you're almost certainly going to be on the right path for the course of the debate, and it will at least give you some sort of like conceptual unity to frame a case around.
Yeah, so the classic example is like having kind of gone through that process of like dredging up as much knowledge as you can about like poaching and that sort of thing. You're in a position to ask like, well, what are we, as the opening government, going to say that the problem is? And clearly, this debate is asking you to say that poaching is so prevalent and or so serious that the existing punishments for it are insufficient and a greater punishment is needed. And then from there, you basically come up with like reasons why that's the case and reasons why it would be good to do so.
Yeah, and this is not to be confused with context. The context for the debate might be the sort of the reason why you're debating it. But
as in, like, what makes it topical?
But when you're setting out the problem at the beginning of the debate, you see a lot of teams come out and give you sort of 30 seconds to a minute of like why this is being debated, which is, I guess, generous to everybody in the debate, that they're prepared to sort of ground the debate in the facts that lead it to being debated. But it's not particularly advantageous for their team. What you need to be doing in terms of framing the problem is recognizing what the context is, but framing it in a certain way that instantly suggests the problem and the solution that will solve that problem.
Can you give an example? Can you give an example?
Well, let's maybe deviate.
Well, sorry, I can, yeah, sure. Like, so the difference between like setting up the context and setting up the problem would be setting up the context, like, and wasting time on it would be kind of like saying, I don't know if this is true or not, like 3 weeks ago, some park rangers in Tanzania caught a bunch of poachers who have been killing rhinoceros for years, and every time they kill rhinoceros, they sell their horns to rhinoceros horn merchants. This leads to great upset in the rhinoceros community, and now the rhinoceros is really threatened. It's like you've like explained at length like a news article, I suppose, from like the recent past. But what you haven't done there is said anything advantageous to your team. So if what you'd said instead was like, as we saw 3 weeks ago when like another lot of rhinoceros poachers were captured, poaching is prevalent and out of control, meaning that the existing legal framework that we have about poaching is clearly not working to solve that problem and to discourage people from engaging in poaching.
Similarly, if the topic was, say, that the West should leave Afghanistan, a bad introduction that is contextual would be something along the lines of, the West has been fighting in Afghanistan for 9 years. In 2009, Barack Obama announced a surge of American troops. We continue to see violence on both sides of the conflict. The conflict seems like it can't be solved. That is why we are discussing whether or not we should stay in Afghanistan, which is like informational, but it's not argumentative. A better introduction would be something along the lines of, the West has been in Afghanistan for 9 years now. It is a war that they cannot win, they don't need to win, and they will not win. And that is why we are proposing leaving Afghanistan. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you're almost, I guess, like setting out at the very beginning some of the like argumentative claims that you're going to make.
The reason why the characterization of the problem matters a lot is that it should be decisive throughout the debate. Because if there is a general agreement that there is a problem that needs to be solved, it often can impose a burden on the opposition that they need to propose an alternative solution.
Yeah. And I think that it's one of those situations where, and I might have said this to some teams on the weekend, like time spent in establishing those sort of things is never time wasted, because at opening government, one of the things that you need to do in order to like fulfill your role in the debate is set up all of the issues that are going to prevail for the rest of the debate. And it's entirely possible for opening government teams to perhaps lose some or all of the issues in the debate and still win the debate in a circumstance where all of the issues that are still being talked about at closing off are issues that the opening government both identified and provided arguments, like persuasive argumentation in relation to. So, spending some time talking about the nature of the problems in Afghanistan in a way that's clearly designed to advance your case is not at all time wasted. And that includes being willing to identify perhaps the facts that might seem tricky to your case or not as advantageous to your case, and taking the time to kind of explain why they don't matter so much or why you have an answer to them or whatever. So one of the things you want to do at Opening Gov is not be a team that gets surprised or made irrelevant by material coming up later in the debate that you didn't speak about, especially if it's material that you already knew.
Yeah, we should say at this point, all of the nature of this format of debating is that it becomes very complex, but there's also a need to be tactically flexible. So all of, the general principles we're giving you are prefaced with it depends, or ended with it depends. And
All things being equal.
There's certain situations in which an overemphasis of the problem is tactically very disadvantageous. So say the topic was that the United States should have a carbon emissions trading system. It would probably be tactically inadvisable at opening government to devote a significant portion of the Prime Minister's speech to proving global warming and proving the necessity to act, when an opposition team, it is well within their tactical reach to say, we think the global warming exists, we think a better solution would be a carbon tax. The reason why that is, that should instantly explain itself. That if you've spent a lot of time explaining why global warming is a problem, you've just wasted that time, given that the logical alternative, or a logical alternative, of a carbon tax has been pursued. Corey?
How do you actually balance making defensive arguments to offensive arguments? Meaning you know what the opposition is going to say, and how do you preempt that without just listing oh, we know this is.
I was actually just about to kind of to get to that. I think probably and just forgive me that I might take a second to answer your question. I think the thing, assuming that we've got past the step of figuring out what on earth the debate is about at all, and now we're trying to find the debate in the sense of put together a Prime Minister's speech that's going to address itself to the important questions. There are basically three things that you need to dominate as the opening government to win the debate. And that is your characterization or explanation of how the motion or the model or the proposal is going to work, your discussion of what the relevant principles are and what the principal decision should be, and then thirdly, your big claim about the benefits or changes that the proposal is going to bring about. In terms of defensive arguments then, you basically want to think about what you need to defend within those three things. So the weighting and the time that you give to those three different things is going to depend based on the motion. So for instance, let's take that we should get out of Afghanistan, or this House would leave Afghanistan. In terms of the characterization of the mechanism, you're going to need in the Prime Minister's speech a very clear explanation of what Afghanistan will look like when the Western troops pull out, and how they will manage that pull-out. Now, in a motion like that, where obviously that seems like one of the big drawbacks, that will probably be a defensive argument. Defensive in the sense that you are anticipating an attack, but it should be an argument that you still use to further your case. So for instance, you want to be providing positive reasons why the situation will either improve or not be as bad as you might think, or something that I guess counters the conventional wisdom that the opening opposition will raise and that the adjudicator will instantly have in their head the moment you propose the motion. In terms of the principle there, that might be a situation where you can go on the offense more. So you could have a principled discussion of how and when the United States should use its military power, when it is appropriate to engage in these wars overseas, and why Afghanistan doesn't fit that. Then obviously in terms of the benefits or the changes that you're going to bring about, you want to think about what is the big difference that your model creates. And obviously, ideally you're claiming much more than just one benefit or change. But you might have, I guess, a couple that are centrally grouped. So in this case, it might be about strengthening America's position in the world. Or alternatively, you might have a really good way of arguing that Afghanistan will actually in the long term be better off. But something like that. And again, that's a situation where perhaps you want to incorporate some defense. If you're talking about how this will change America's global position, there might be an obvious attack about how it will strengthen Al-Qaeda and make America look weak. That you might want to think about countering in the Prime Minister's speech.
So to give you, we'll get to your question in a second, to give you a slightly different example, in any debate about rights, rights are going to be balanced against each other, right? So you can probably bring in some anticipatory material in the last bit of the Prime Minister's speech by explaining why the infringement on rights is not that big. So take, for example, to go back to the topic about removing the exclusionary rule. Your third argument might be something along the lines of why we think that, why we don't think this will lead to excess, which is not really a positive argument in favour of doing it, but it's certainly a key premise that you will need to prove to show that this is not, to prove that it is beneficial. In part, you have to show it's not as bad as it might seem to be. So under that argument, you might have something like a couple of different reasons as to why you think that the abolition of the exclusionary rule will not lead to like widespread abuses of civil rights. The first might be that you like retain residual police discretion over when and in what circumstances a house will be searched and evidence will be used, which in itself like means that the power will be exercised responsibly. The second is that like there'll be media scrutiny of this, and we think that will be like a useful vehicle for ensuring there won't be excesses. And thirdly, we think that like there's like a final source of political accountability, that at some point, like if it's going to be this sort of dystopian world of everybody's home being searched and then everybody being sued upon the basis of what they find in the home, there is no way that like politicians and the public will accept that. So we think those are all like moderating influences for us to think that the infringement on this right will actually be fairly minimal. So we'll see a substantial benefit in terms of evidence that we would otherwise be missing out on in prosecuting criminals, and we won't be seeing like widespread abuses of everyday civil rights.
George, if you can hang on to your question just for a second longer. The thing to think about then is like, if you're going to have a defensive argument, how do you make it offensive? And one of the best ways of doing that is just to acknowledge and meet head on what it is you're trying to defend yourself against. So say, we accept that there will be some innocent people who will go to jail because we're abolishing the exclusionary rule. That's obvious, we're not going to deny it. But what we will do is prove to you why it won't be as many as you might think, and why the benefits that we gain from prosecuting many more guilty people and putting them in jail outweighs that. So, that is what fundamentally makes a strong Prime Minister's speech, is a speech that doesn't try and paper over perhaps the cracks in your case, or doesn't try and gloss over the areas in which you're weak, but acknowledges them head on and then provides like strong, pithy, packages of reasons why your team still prevails. And that idea of like packaging up reasons on those big questions is really useful for an opening government especially, because by numbering them off and labelling them really clearly, you can refer back to them for the rest of the debate. So I coached a high school team a few years ago who got a topic that was that the United States should promote democracy in the Middle East. And they had like a total brain explosion in prep and decided that their model would be that the US would invade Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, Iran and Syria. Now, all things being equal, they should lose that debate. Potentially they did. Chris was coaching the other team. But the one thing they did was sit there in prep and come up with like 5 or 6 reasons why they could conduct those wars differently to the way in which the war in Iraq was fought, and why that would mean they would succeed where the war in Iraq had failed. And the reason that they managed to squeak home against kind of common sense and the fairness in the debating world is that the other team never responded point by point to those 5 very clear reasons, and it allowed the team for the rest of the debate to say, we gave you these 5 reasons why this is different to Iraq, so you can't get away with just saying, but Iraq was bad, but Iraq was bad. And one of the things to think about then when you're opening government and you have kind of limited points of information is how much easier it is for you to refer to it in points of information when you've gone through that process of numbering it off and of packaging it up like that. George?
Common criticism that you hear in nearly any adjudication to a debate round is, I really like that argument, I would have loved to hear more about it. How can you make sure that in prep time you're not just identifying the important arguments of the debate, you're actually making them fully and analysing them in a way to make sure they'll stick in the round going forward?
Look, I guess all of this kind of advice we're giving about spending a lot of time thinking about the motion and that sort of thing runs off the assumption that things are starting to go wrong. How is it that you avoid someone saying an argument was underdeveloped? You just develop it more by spending more time on it in prep. I don't think there's an easy answer to that. It's just one of those things where hopefully the more you practice and the more debates you see, you identify the issues much faster, and the majority of your prep is spent on coming up with the really good reasons and really good argumentation to deal with the hard bits of your case, and to develop maybe the interesting or challenging or adventurous arguments. But getting the basics right is the most important thing, I guess. And it's probably better off for an adjudicator to say you had an interesting argument that was underdeveloped than to kind of have developed the crap out of that argument and not thought about how your model's going to work.
I think in this format of debating, and probably all formats of debating, you have to almost be like relentlessly self-critical. So when you're writing out an argument, to ask yourself, well, like, what's the logical opposition to this? And then almost incorporate that into making your arguments. So like recognizing that some people might think this, we think this value prevails because of these reasons. So to be making arguments where you're constantly almost aware of what the clash in the debate is, but still advancing a strong position, cognizant of that. And like this concept of self-criticism is not just about when you're framing an argument, but in this format of debating, and especially on this circuit where it seems like team combinations are perhaps slightly more static than on other circuits where people tend to debate with each other day in, day out, and tournament, like on a regular basis at a lot of tournaments, you really need to be sort of calibrating your shared mutual tactical insights into debating and views on what works in this format by asking each other, like at the end of each round, what were sort of some other things you could have done better, as well as chatting to adjudicators and making a collective judgment about what worked well in the debate and what worked badly, so that in future rounds you have like lots of reference points for particular strategies that are either advisable or inadvisable in a debate.
I guess if the Prime Minister has so much to do, how do you strike the balance between the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister? What should you be leaving to the Deputy Prime Minister? Should he be doing more analysis, or should he take one of those points that you've been, like your 3 points, how do you balance that?
The way I've always done it at Worlds is just that you spend your 15 minutes in prep on the Prime Minister's speech. And to some extent leave the deputy to fend for themselves. And I'll kind of like get into why that's the case. Those 3 crucial things, they should all be in the Prime Minister's speech. There's just no point allowing the debate to go anywhere until you've laid out the main things that you're going to rely on. I think it is fine and perhaps advisable for a Prime Minister's speech to have 4 to 5 to 6 arguments rather than 2 to 3. You know, it depends how you define an argument, and obviously one of the things that you get with experience is the ability to say things correctly and succinctly the first time, which lets you just say a lot more. But certainly you want to have a lot in your Prime Minister's speech, and the Deputy then should basically be helping the Prime Minister come up with examples and reasons and make sure they've covered everything that they need to. What the Deputy should then basically do is, as the Prime Minister is like, you know, getting their speech written, is put themselves in the position of the closing. So if we were the closing government, what extension would we run, having just heard this case that's in the Prime Minister's speech, and basically run that extension. Alternatively, the Deputy can listen to the opposition leader's allocation of arguments, and if they allocate a substantive argument, especially, pardon me, to the Deputy Op leader, steal that and turn it into a substantive argument on your side. So for instance, say you've forgotten a stakeholder. Say, you know, it's that exclusionary rule debate, and they say, and then the deputy opposition leader is going to talk about the impact of this on victims' families, and you haven't got an argument about victims' families. You start writing an argument about victims' families there. Maybe the closing government will be like a little bit unstrategic and offer a point of information that flags their extension or alludes to their extension. If that's the case, try and back solve it and figure it out. That is, I guess, a potentially a high risk, high return strategy, but I think it's like, I'll get to you in a sec, Burke. I think it's a tactic well worth employing, because although sometimes it leaves the deputy in a position where the judge might afterwards say, I didn't think you had any good material, or I didn't think your material was very good, it allows so much more flexibility and allows for such a better Prime Minister's speech that more often than not it's going to pay off, and you'll have a lot more material to put out there anyway. And also, as with kind of the rest of the process, by putting yourself in a position where you have to think really hard about how you're going to find another argument, it kind of sharpens the mind. Because one of the worst things you can do at opening government is like be satisfied with what you've got. Kind of after 5 minutes of prep, be like, all right, those are all our arguments. We're just going to work on filling them out. When you kind of need to constantly be making sure you've covered everything and constantly taking into account new perspectives. But
I can kind of answer this myself, but I've also been told don't bring like the first speaker needs to flag everything that your side is going to talk about.
Don't.
So, yeah.
I mean, if you feel a like compulsive and unavoidable need to allocate to your deputy, just say like, and you know, and my deputy is going to expand on some of the broader themes in the debate. Or, you know, my deputy is going to look at how this impacts how this will work in the long term, or how this impacts on major stakeholders. Like, it's just not important. I mean, a judge might occasionally say it would have been nice to hear you allocate, but there's just no point. I mean, you at opening government, the one advantage that you have in the debate, despite having less time to think and less time to rebut, the one advantage you have is like some element of surprise, and you may as well preserve that as to the deputy's material. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you want to spend prep time basically only on the Prime Minister's speech, and I guess Leader of the Opposition,
Yep.
conversely, for a second team, should you focus primarily on the member's speech and leave the whip to fend for himself?
No. Mainly because you don't really want to write the member's speech before the debate starts.
Okay.
You need to hear, I think, at least the Prime Minister and the Opposition Leader before you even start thinking about what you're going to run as your extension. All you should be doing in the closing half is basically just like brainstorming potential extensions, potential examples, potential ways of making arguments, and then kind of communicate and make a call in the debate. Yep.
How do you want to focus your prep time then as a second team while you're waiting for the big themes to come out from the two
We might put that on
leaders?
hold for a second and just make sure we exhaust everything in opening government before we go into that. Have we? Are there any more questions, I guess, about opening government? Yeah.
Well, this could apply to almost any team, but communication between Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister during the debate. So, like, the Leader of the Opposition's got up there. How do you two communicate? Or do you communicate, or do you just trust each other enough that...
We would often have lots of small arguments over insignificant things.
Creative tension.
I don't think either of us like to talk that much during debates. I mean, it's very much just finding a dynamic that works for you. And that we would have probably talked about enough debates together and done enough debates together to have, I think, a good sense of how the other one might approach it, which gives us like the dividend of having more individual time to prepare your speech. I think that it's always very important for the Prime Minister, especially, just to have like a significant portion of the prep time available to write their own speech, just almost without distraction. And that if they want something, they can just ask the deputy for it. And it's the same principle that it makes almost no sense in the 30 seconds before someone speaks to try and interrupt them. Like, it's too late at that point to give them any particular advice, unless it's like an absolutely blinding insight. In that, it's like you never see in professional sport, as like players are running onto the arena, the coach giving them like last minute tactical advice or anything. There's like a bit of a window, and that period should be very much about like a speaker finding a clear sense of how they're going to introduce the debate and what they want to do in their speech.
I think one of the things that makes a lot of communication at the table less necessary is if everyone is doing their job in terms of note taking. So the deputy Prime Minister, especially because they have nothing else to do aside from maybe write their substantive, should be taking pretty detailed notes on their Prime Minister's speech. So they should have a very clear sense of what the case was that they decided to run in prep, and what the case is that comes out of the Prime Minister's speech. Because obviously, like, the nature of debating and people being inconsistent is that sometimes that will change. And one of the worst things that can happen is like to have that little tension of emphasis that comes about when the deputy hasn't really listened to the Prime Minister. The other thing as well then is the deputy needs to have a really good radar for what the Prime Minister has and hasn't developed. So when I was debating my first 2 worlds with my old partner who spoke Prime Minister, what we would do is prep, I guess, 4 to 6 arguments, put them all in the Prime Minister's speech, and he wouldn't do an allocation of his arguments, and then he would just, like, when he got the 1 minute clap, know how much he could get through, and I would pick up the ones he didn't get to. So it was like really important to listen to his speech and how many arguments he got through to know what was going to be in my speech then. But certainly, if you already have an idea of what the Prime Minister has and hasn't spent time explaining, you'll have a pretty good idea of what you need to pick up the pieces on.
I think as well that that's, like, it's not just a question of the tally of arguments, but just what they haven't developed. Like, if they have like a couple of reasons why something might come about, and then in just them saying that, you've realised a couple more, and it's like the central point of the debate. Often it can make sense to make that one issue in the deputy's speech, and to note that the Prime Minister has already developed material in this respect, and advertise that you're conscious of that, but you'd like to further add a couple of key points in this, on this particular issue that advances your cause. Can I just say while we seem to have sort of morphed into basically a position-by-position discussion of the debate, and that may well be like a useful framework for trying to give tactical advice. But with respect to the opening government, one of the clearest things that you need to do is to make sure you engage with the closing opposition, because they have a lot of advantages in the debate, not least they have like an hour to think about the debate before they have to speak. So you should really make sure you're taking points of information from very early in the debate, so you're directly contrasting your two competing approaches in the debate, and you're able to sort of give at least some early responses to what they might say. And one of, I think, the most common results in this format is to see sort of the closing opposition come first and the opening government come second. It actually, like, I'm not aware of the statistics, but impressionistically and intuitively, I feel that is a common result. And part of the reason why that occurs is because opening governments are too concerned with what is across from them and not concerned enough with what is diagonally.
It's certainly a common result if you assume that the opening government and closing op are equal teams. So if they're the best two teams in the debate of equal ability, more often than not, the one that's a closing op will beat the one that's opening gov because of all those advantages. One of the things to think about is whether you are giving the adjudicator reasons in the deliberation to give you the win. And a big thing that adjudicators will do if they're thinking about opening government versus closing op is look at those points of information and say, well, when opening government tried to interact with closing opposition, were they asked good questions? Did they give good responses? Did they seem to have the measure of the team? And that's kind of the goal of doing that. Do you guys, we're really happy to kind of do what you guys want, because we can wax lyrical, I guess, all day. Do you think it would be a good idea to talk about how you make an extension, how you come up with an extension in the debate?
I think before we do, there's maybe some like profitable stuff to talk about in terms of like opening opposition strategy.
Yeah.
Sure.
Actually, if I could ask one more for opening gov.
Yeah.
Actually, I suppose it applies to every team as well, but just your very first words that come out of how do you determine your opener?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman.
They always say they hate that.
Really?
Well, a lot of times I say I would have liked a more interesting opening.
In terms of introductions, I think just from like my experience judging at HWS, they're probably like a bit lacking on this circuit. You should have an attempt to make them. What the introduction is like a matter of personal choice, but in general, you want to get at like the context and the problem, basically, at opening government. Whatever it is, it's worth scripting it in prep, having an attempt to actually get the wording of it right, deliver it with a bit of passion. Even if it's just a joke, you just want something that, like, I guess in like really basic public speaking terms, like captures the audience's attention. Because adjudicating debating can be like one of life's most boring tasks, and adjudicators really appreciate just an attempt to persuade and engage.
And the first 30 seconds of the Prime Minister's speech are almost the most important. That's almost the most important segment of the debate, where they're laying out what the debate is, and the adjudicator have some expectations of what the debate might be like, but they will almost probably, after that 30 seconds, know exactly what the debate will be like. So if you register a very strong impression at that particular moment, it can be immensely advantageous. And I remember seeing a World Schools final on the topic that this House would grant an amnesty to illegal immigrants, and the equivalent of the Prime Minister, the first speaker, began with something along the lines of like, all across developed countries, there are about 20 million people who don't exist. 20 million people who go to school, who draw paychecks, who use medical facilities, but in the eyes of the government, they are not people. Which is like, I think, a rhetorically powerful introduction that gets at what will be the key underlying premise of the government case, that you have to address the hidden numbers of people that are illegal immigrants, and that you have to do something about those people, regardless of what the prospective consequences for immigration policy are. They would have sort of stepped through their stakeholders and decided, well, the stakeholder who sort of we are best arguing for are illegal immigrants. And what happens to those people who have already come to a country illegally, in that the opposition will have to prove that they just don't care about the fates of these people. So if you've staked a very strong claim on that and reflected it in the introduction, it's going to be pretty powerful for the rest of the debate. As well as just like, it captures an audience's attention and makes them concentrate on what you're saying.
And one more, what's the best introduction you remember ever giving? Or the one that received the best response?
I have like almost no memory of that. I don't know.
I like the Indiana Jones joke. That was
Yeah.
that was nice.
Do you guys specialize? Is it one of you always does prime minister, or one of you always?
Yeah, although, I mean, it's like basically a combination by combination thing. So the way we did Worlds was I spoke first in the opening half and second in the closing half, but most of the other time I've been at Worlds, I spoke second in the closing half and second in the opening half. It's purely a matter of what works for you as a combination. And I guess one of the things, just to say, is like you should try that out. Like we settled on that combination after kind of trying all of them and just, you know, being...
It was one of those things, I mean, we probably always thought we were going to do that combination, but at least like switched around in both halves of the debate as to who spoke where to just test the waters, and generally didn't get great reviews, so we're back.
I think as a general rule, when you get the right positions, it clicks and you kind of know it. Although it's much easier to figure out in BP. Like when we're doing 3-on-3, there are I think 9 different combinations of where you can speak, whereas you know, there's only kind of 4 here, so it's a little easier to figure out.
Sure, Steve, you look like you're about to have a question. But
No, I have a question. I have many questions, but I'm thinking. I can ask a question. But it's very it's not the character of the questions that are being asked. So I'm not terribly interested in tricks or technical matters.
Yeah.
What is your research strategy for preparing for a tournament? What do you prep motions? Do you write briefs? Do you turn on ABC and watch 10 minutes of it and then go to bed? Like, what do you do?
I guess the first thing to probably note is that you need a really strong base of general debating knowledge. No, it's not. I guess it's not general knowledge. It's like general debating knowledge. So you know, you need a strong base of like political history, of like policy ideas and themes, that sort of thing. Which basically you get by putting in maybe a 12 to 24 month period of like working really hard, of like consciously going out to investigate things you don't know, reading up when you find something else you don't know, putting that on your list to read up about until you have that like general level of understanding. I guess kind of because Chris and I both did a lot of debating at school, we probably put in that time, so to speak, when we were at school, and then once you have that base, all you're doing is updating your knowledge. So immediately before a tournament, we did a bit of case preps. I don't love doing it. I found it like a little bit boring, but there's some really easy and simple things. So one is get maybe the 6 copies of The Economist before the tournament, go through the contents page with an Excel spreadsheet open, and just note down the page reference and the topic of all the articles in the issue of The Economist. Then alphabetize the Excel spreadsheet and print it out. So rather than like reading every copy of The Economist, you just get a quick reference guide to what's in them. So when you get a topic on like Africa and mining policy, you can like look down your index and see if it comes up. And obviously you want to kind of log articles under multiple headings so it's as detailed as possible. We did that for Worlds this year, and it was like useful in probably a third of the rounds. We just that kind of reference guide. Other people, though, will sit down and do matter preps. There was a topic, an Octo final topic at Australs in 2008 about hymen reconstruction surgery, and one of the Sydney speakers had a matter prep on it. So, not sure what he was thinking about when he thought he should do a matter prep on it. But, you know, certainly, like, if you hear something that you think would make a good topic, you might want to sit down and think about how you'd argue each side and look up a few pertinent facts. And you can kind of put them in like a big emasculating backpack and carry it around at tournaments, or maybe in tubs if you're from the policy tradition. Although you probably need, I guess, like a little less of that than maybe a policy team would.
Sorry, just we'll get to the question in a second. I would have a couple of different things. I think the important point whenever you're doing any research is to try and work out how you can apply it in a debating context. So if you're listening to something, I like to listen to a lot of podcasts, and if I'll from like a whole range of things. And if you hear like a particular piece of information and think, wow, that is like a great piece of information, like rather than just like registering the piece of information, think about like how you could apply it in the debate, and like visualize yourself almost just like making that argument and using this as like the killer piece of information. The second thing I'd say is that to the extent that I would like deliberately research stuff, I think it would be after I've made a determination that there are some things which are topical but are very heavily weighted one way. So say if the topic was like that the US should have healthcare reform, and I was only, there was a probability that I was going to have to at some point debate this topic, and a 1 in 2 probability that I would be opposing healthcare reform. I would want to have like 4 or 5 different points as to like particular statistics that would prove my broader arguments about why this was unnecessary. Say the topic, like to go back to this question about Afghanistan, notwithstanding like the events that seem to have happened overnight about the negotiations, for like the last 2 years, it's been very clear that like Afghanistan has been going to the dogs. So I would want to have like, here are like 3 clear things that we would do differently to stay in Afghanistan and win the war, and have researched like a particular person that might believe this, or find that killer piece of information, so that if there's a debate that you will inevitably debate at some point, to just be armed on both sides if it is like quite weighted.
I think the way to think about that is it's much more efficient and smart to do like issue-based research rather than motion-based research. So work on like putting together packages of arguments that you can use in lots of different motions of a similar type, rather than specifically one argument. So back in the day when you were debating about, say, the equivalent of the Australian equivalent of the Patriot Act, one of the things that was always hard to establish was like whether Australia was actually under threat from terrorists. So you might have like a list of 7 reasons why we knew there was a significant terror threat to Australia, and you could then deploy that in like all manner of different debates within that field, and that's like a really efficient way of doing it. The other thing to think about is examples that can be used to prove arguments in all sorts of different debates. So that is like a classic example was I was reading, I'm not sure if anyone else saw it in Slate maybe 6 or 8 weeks ago, an article about this guy who'd moved to Sweden with his wife, and was just like loving the fact that Sweden has enormously generous parental leave. So I think it's like 460 days a year, and they've set 20% aside that has to be taken by the husband, and the result is that in Sweden now it's like really common to have stay-at-home dads who are like walking the stroller through the park and like doing all the things that stereotypically you'd assume mum does. And that is like a fantastic example of how government policy can concretely change culture and change people's actions. And you can deploy that example to like prove or illustrate points in all sorts of different debates, right? And the way in which you gain that example in your arsenal to use is just like, as Chris said, when you read it or when you hear it, you kind of log it away in the way in which it is relevant in a debate, and then you can kind of bring it back to prove arguments of that type, almost no matter what the motion.
Yeah. The other thing that I would say, I reckon there's like about 40, maybe 50 examples that account for like 95% of the examples used in debating. And it just helps, I think, to know them inside out. So what happened with like sanctions in South Africa? Did they work? Did they not work? And be sort of armed with like a couple of facts on either side of that characterization. Like, what was the Rwanda genocide? I mean, especially in international relations, I think it makes sense to just know like the generic reference points inside out and have counterintuitive takes on them that you think, for the very reason that if you come up with anyone who's using them in a generic way, you can really put them in their place by saying, actually, like, that's wrong for these 3 reasons. You completely misused or mischaracterized what happened here. Similarly, I think that, like, say for example, like the US Supreme Court decisions in Roe v. Wade and on the death penalty. You might use those arguments to either prove the role that the judiciary has in advancing basic legal rights, or by contrast, you might sort of like counterintuitively argue that the Supreme Court decision to legalize abortion through the Constitution actually set back the cause of reproductive rights activists, because for these reasons, it actually created a big backlash that we think only incited a movement in the other direction and displaced sort of an inevitable legislative momentum that would have created that right through the political process. So, like, but equally you might say that that example proves that there are certain insuperable political obstacles to implementing basic rights, whatever your point of view on this particular issue is, and that accordingly, like, that should be applied in this other context where we're trying to do that.
How would you go about identifying like the 40 or 50 examples that you need to know? Like, do you just brainstorm them, or is there a list?
I guess it's I guess it's just like they're like 40 or 50 years, you know, like an approximation. Just use your experience, I guess.
Sure.
Think about what examples keep coming up. Think about what motions keep getting set.
Okay, so I mean, like, yeah, I mean, most of them are sort of social or foreign policy landmarks. So, like, what happened with welfare reform in the mid-90s in the US? What happened with zero tolerance?
What has been the effect of TARP since 2008?
Yeah.
One of the things that you should probably develop is like a bit of an appetite for the counterintuitive. Like a classic example of this is like the Freakonomics, the like first chapter in that book about how the massive drops in crime rates in the 1990s is like best explained by the access to abortion after Roe and Wade. Like classic example of a counterintuitive and like persuasive take on a commonly used example. And it's probably worth thinking when you're kind of, reading for general knowledge / interest in like trying to seek out some writers who are a bit more counterintuitive, like people who are kind of going out of their way to like debunk common themes of argument or like common misconceptions in policy. And like those kind of people are out there. I mean, it's probably not worth going into like a list of them, but keep an eye out for people who you think are like counterintuitive and try to go against the grain.
That's the final point that I wanted to make about like research before a tournament and just like research in general, is that I think it's a very useful way of like processing a lot of relevant information to use like a blog reader that processes like RSS feeds. So like Google Reader is pretty useful. NetNewsWire is like a good offline version of Google Reader. But it's like very easy for one to share information with your partner, and you might know that like, have a look at this blog post. I think this is like a good counterintuitive take on this issue.
Yeah, so we set up.
You just get through information so much quicker.
So we set up
going like clicking through ads and so forth.
We set up in Google Reader a like sharing group. I mean, we're not like techie people, so I guess you can figure it out yourselves better than we can explain it to you. But a sharing group such that if I read something in Google Reader and wanted to share it, I would click share. You can share with a comment, so you could say, this is a great example of how things are improving in Afghanistan, favourite it, and then when your partner logs on to their Google Reader, it comes up with, Steve has shared 3 new items. It's like really, really easy and good. There's a question up the back.
And just very quickly, it's much like easier to manage than just getting emails all the time, which you don't read.
Like with the abortion thing, I was like, is the rate like, did it go down per person or is it just because there are less people?
I think briefly the argument is that greater access to.
If you were the opposition of whoever said that. Like,
sorry?
If you were the opposition of whoever said that.
Well,
I'm not really sure.
I actually think it has been discredited.
Okay, because I think it would be really easy to discredit if it's
Yes.
Yeah, but I mean, the point, like this is obviously like being able to then like take down the counterintuitive stuff, kind of to the nth degree. But like, certainly like you want to kind of like know a little bit more about any example so that you can spin it in a way that suits you.
I mean, that would be useful if someone was saying we need like these aggressive law enforcement measures, because as we saw in the US in like the late 1990s, with the introduction of like zero tolerance policing, we saw like a corresponding drop in like the following crime rates. If then like someone came out and said, well, like, look, I mean, we would concede that the crime rate dropped, but we think that it's like it's correlation but not causation in this instance. What the real cause was this, and you've completely you've at least advanced like some good reasons as to like, and based on empirical evidence as to why an argument should be diminished.
Yeah. A classic example, just for like anyone who's a politics buff now, is like there is a fair bit of pretty strong evidence to suggest that
outcomes of midterm elections are dictated most by the change in the employment rate and GDP growth rate immediately before the election, much more than anything else. So there is like pretty good reason to suspect that almost any media narrative that's constructed in the month before the midterms and like the month afterwards is like pretty bogus. And the decision was like predetermined by the economy. All right, research. Any more questions on that?
What we were just going to jump to very quickly is, if that was great, but it's just like a couple of observations about opening opposition strategy.
And reacting at opening up.
And reacting at opening up. The first point that I would emphasise, and this is, I think, another very common result, is that an opening government can totally suck, and they can take the opening opposition down with them. And you see it happening time and again, that there is the closing teams come first and second, in whatever order, and the opening opposition comes third, and the opening government comes fourth. And like, there's no solace in like just taking the third above an atrocious opening government. What I would say is that in the instance of where you know that like the opening government is like just completely ballsing it up, it's often like very important to anticipate where the debate is heading and register responses on what are some of the obvious contentions in the government side of the case, and just attribute them to the opening government. So if you've prepped properly, even if an opening government has made a mess of it, you might come out and say, well, what we heard from the opening government was this, and what we think they were getting at was this. We still think that is wrong for these reasons.
Yeah. Or structure it as an even if. So like the opening, like we heard from the opening government this, that is obviously wrong for these two reasons. Even if they had, pointed out the comments of David Betrayus, or even if they had, pointed you to the things that have happened recently in Helmand Province, we think that that is best explained by X and not Y. So you kind of just like, don't let yourself be caught by doing enough to beat the opening government, because you need to do enough to win the debate. So don't, for instance, be satisfied with just taking down the argumentation that the opening government brings forward. So if they have like big logical fallacies in their argument, point them out, but don't just point them out, because what you need to do is actually win the issue that those logical fallacies were related to.
And like, you often see speakers come up and they'll be like, sifting through like the primordial swamp that was the Prime Minister's speech. We still could probably deduce these three arguments. Here is why they are wrong. The other thing that I would say is, there's no point. I mean, it's fun to take the easy kicks, but you need to, I think, be a bit more ambitious in like what you're doing in the event that the opening government doesn't do a great job. Because instantly, it's going to be very easy for the closing government to fulfil their role in the debate, because by way of extension, they can just make the obvious points. So, and that's the third thing that I'd say is you really should directly contrast. Like, just forget about them for the rest of the debate. Take your points of information from the closing team, which you probably should be doing anyway, so you're directly contrasting. But make it like, almost just ignore a team that is combusting, and do everything you can to like avoid catching fire as well.
So let's assume that the opening government have like gone severely awry in a couple of ways. Okay, let's say the first one is like the most common, which is just that the opening government don't fulfill their role in a basic sense of setting up the debate. So the opening government might not provide, I guess, a definition by which, in university debating we really just mean a model, or some set of limits on the model, or they don't provide any particular context. They don't, for instance, specify whether the debate is occurring in a particular place or in a particular part of the world. When we talk about role fulfillment, it is the role of the opening government to do those things, but it's also like the role of the opening half to establish those things. So if those things are missing, you need to do it at opposition leader. You can't set yourself a good foundation in the debate if you let the wishy-washiness of the opening government also be wishy-washiness on your behalf. And the way you should do it is by a judicious use of clearly stated assumptions and estimations and questions. I say a judicious use of that mixture because what you shouldn't do is just stand up and say, they didn't tell us where this occurs. Where does it occur? They didn't tell us why we're having the motion. Why are we having the motion?
Because, like, A, you let the opening government then, like, have a second chance at fulfilling their role, but B, you will, like, piss off the adjudicator because you are making him none the wiser, only pointing out that, like, you have asked the questions that he was asking while he was writing down his notes for the Prime Minister's speech. So, what you want to kind of do is, like, try and provide some reasoned guesses and assumptions. So, we think, in light of the recent decision to do X, this debate is probably about this issue, you know, for these reasons. You know, we're not entirely sure whether this model was going to be limited to, whether this model was going to apply to all prisoners, or whether it was just prisoners serving life sentences. You know, we think in either event it has these problems, or we think that, you know, most of the times it's been implemented around the world, it's been done in this way. So you kind of, like, backfill that as much as is humanly possible. You might think that in doing so you're kind of wasting your time, and unless you do actually waste time, you're not. As in, if the Prime Minister has, like, left that out and it should have been a minute or two of their speech, it could probably be a minute or two of your speech, as long as you're not, you know, making the mistake that a bad Prime Minister would make, of just providing exposition without actually advancing an argument. So, you know, you're not doing the Prime Minister a favour here. You're, like, seizing on the opportunity that he's left you by failing to give the first attempt at characterising these things by giving it yourself. So, for instance, say there's a debate about healthcare, and there is no mention in the Prime Minister's speech what the healthcare system is in the United States. You need to make an attempt to set that up, hopefully in a way that favours you in the opposition leader's speech. Okay, let's go with, like, scenario 2. So scenario 2 is that the Prime Minister has set the debate up in a way that is, like, completely and utterly at odds with what you've prepared and with the material that you've prepared for the debate. I guess there's, like, a few things you should do there. The first one is, you know, very briefly, consider whether the definition is legitimate. Maybe you're just doing that to, like, reassure yourself, because my understanding of the rules are that there are virtually no circumstances in which you can validly contest a definition. Maybe if they've taken the debate about healthcare and said, you know, we set this motion in England in the year 1200 and believe that, like, you know, Richard III should provide pensions to his retired soldiers. Like, maybe 300 years before he exists, even more unreasonable. You know, like, maybe in that circumstance you could challenge the definition, but I guess briefly ask yourself that question. The next thing you want to do is figure out what of the material you've prepared is still relevant to the debate. And there's a few ways you can think about salvaging your material. One is you can kind of divorce it from this particular context you thought the debate was going to be about. So if you thought this was a debate about healthcare reform in the US, and the team from New Zealand has made it about healthcare reform in Noumea, you know, maybe you can strip out all of the references to the US system and instead talk more generally on each argument. So if this was about, you know, it strengthens the rights of the patient, you can use all of the stuff that doesn't rely on the specific context. The other thing you can do then is change your examples from, I guess, specific examples to examples by analogy. So instead of, and we saw this problem in the system when blah, 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 you know, to, and we think it will happen in a similar way to what happened in America under blah, blah, blah. So kind of tweaking your examples and tweaking your arguments to work there.
So to put some flesh on that bone, if the topic was something along the lines of, like, this House believes that sanctions are an illegitimate tool of foreign policy, and the opening government had come out and said that this debate was about the Australian government lifting their trade sanctions on Fiji, that would be, like, probably a legitimate topic set in Australia, but I suspect that would not be legitimate in the US. And if you had on the opposition, like, quite rightly come up with a couple of examples of, like, what you thought were legitimate sanctions, you might have, like, a counterintuitive take on why the sanctions on Cuba have worked to some extent or prevented some greater harm, then you would come out and say, like, I mean, not only are we going to disprove why the Australian government should not, or should lift their sanctions on Fiji, but we think this topic is getting at something slightly more general, which is the question of the role of sanctions in foreign policy. And we're going to apply all of the specifics in this example to disproving the example and proving the generality of the motion.
I think the main danger there that I think we would face if we were actually in the round is for the judge to, at the end of the debate, say you didn't adapt your case enough to the winning government.
And there's like you've got to be aware of the situations in which it is legitimate to place set. Like I think if the topic was this House believes that there should be an amnesty for illegal immigrants, that it would be perfectly legitimate for someone to set that in the US because it's plainly more of a problem in the US just by scale of numbers, and it has more geopolitical consequences than it does in, say, New Zealand. But if you were to set it in New Zealand, I think that is like plainly unfair. Similarly, if the topic was this House believes, like the sanctions one, I reckon it is legitimate to set that in Burma. It's probably legitimate to set that in Cuba. It's probably legitimate to set that in North Korea or Iran. And in those instances, I think you probably would have to run with the specifics and not look to expand it. But it shouldn't actually be a problem for you because all of your arguments that would be phrased generally just then get phrased like specifically. Like we think that sanctions harm people and not governments. It would just be, we think sanctions will harm the people of Iran, not the government of Iran. Yeah. Like there's a famous example of a Sydney team at Worlds in I think like 2001, and they're in a quarterfinal, and the topic was this House supports the one-child policy, or would support a one-child policy, and they were opening opposition, thought the debate was obviously going to be about whether or not the one-child policy is good for China, but it was turned into surrogate mothers only being allowed to have one child, and they were like, what? But apparently the process was just like looking down the list of arguments, and I guess all of their arguments about like parental rights to reproduce still applied in a wholly different context, and it was literally just a matter of changing the nouns in the argument.
We might just pause questions for a second and just like finish this spiel. I guess the thing to think about, especially in the opposition leader's speech, is just flagging that this has happened. So, who would have ever thought that a World's quarter-final about the one-child policy would happen to actually be about a policy of one child for surrogates? But, assuming that the opening government have the right to do that, here's the problems with that policy anyway. So it's worth kind of bringing to the adjudicator's attention that you've been hard done by without harping on it, and maybe in a way that kind of makes light of the opening government.
Questions? Sorry, you had a question, yeah.
I was just wondering, when you put something in a specific nation, like in the US, is it still alright to draw on general human experience, or should every example you bring up be United States?
I think it's perfectly logical to draw on general experience. Like, if an amnesty has worked well in another country, there's every reason to believe that it might work well in the US. I mean, certainly, like, if the debate was about healthcare reform, the fact that like the rest of the world has a functioning, albeit socialist, healthcare system that delivers like more and better health outcomes cheaper, that would certainly be like an instructive experience in arguing as to why it might apply.
And that's a classic example of a counterintuitive argument to go and look up. Like, what are a list of reasons why America's healthcare system is actually much better than all those other countries? I mean, maybe that's not counterintuitive for you. I make
Also, to think about that topic, it's also, just to go back to what we were talking about before in terms of an opening government strategy which might try and, in the last portion of the Prime Minister's speech, look to sort of prove a premise and anticipate some of the arguments. One of the ways in which you might frame that third issue in the context of healthcare, like universal healthcare, is the third argument might be why the healthcare market demands government intervention. So you would say that healthcare is different to, say, a market for fast food, a market for clothes, a market for cars, in that the consumers are fundamentally in a position of vulnerability, but lacking in information which would allow the market mechanism to properly work. That expertise has a higher value. So any argument that a healthcare market would be more efficient and more profitable or sort of cheaper because of factors of competition doesn't work in the instance of healthcare, because consumers are insufficiently informed for that consumer mechanism to produce all of the benefits that would accrue. So for that reason, like, we think government intervention is not only important, but it is more efficient than in the instance of a private system, because unlike the consumer, the government can often be well informed about what the right healthcare decisions are for a particular person.
Alright, final scenario as the leader of the opposition, which is that the topic is set up in such a way that none of your arguments are salvageable.
given that I coach a lot of high school debating, you get to see this happen like more than you otherwise would. And there was a debate last year where the topic was that we should make a first strike on Iran. And the affirmative team, or the opening government, said we should make a first strike on Iran by the United States unilaterally disarming all of its nuclear weapons so as to surprise Iran and get them to come to the negotiating table. So like in that situation, like literally none of the arguments you prepared can be used because the debate is like completely and probably illegitimately different. What you need to do in that situation is just give a speech of entirely rebuttal and don't kind of flag that as such, but just say, I'm going to deal with 3 issues in this speech. And then what you do is exactly what we were saying that you should do if you have a bad opening government, which is rebut the problems in the argumentation and then still provide the substantive reasons. You just need to work much faster to do it. Okay? So like their first argument, like it will make Iran negotiate. So like the first issue I'm going to look at is whether this will succeed in having negotiations. And you point out maybe something they said that was like a bit illogical or silly, and then you talk about in a bit more depth why having a position of strength in negotiations is always important. So you basically just put yourself under the pump and try and do like both things at once and just like adopt, I guess, the structure probably of the arguments the Prime Minister brought up. Yep.
This is getting back to something from a couple of minutes ago,
yep.
But could you talk a little bit more about setting the motion away from your normal Western liberal democracies and into, a country or something that would be otherwise affected by this motion, like sanctions set in Cuba?
Okay, I think
just to close this off, because we actually didn't state it. The only circumstances in which it is, I think, legitimate to set a debate to a particular geographic location is that location is where these issues are at their most acute. But secondly, where I think like the average reasonably informed debater would be expected to know some of the specifics in this instance, which is a pretty high threshold to meet on most issues.
I think like the general rule is like don't be a dick. Your job when you're setting up a debate is to like facilitate a debate, not to like sneakily win. And if you have like so little confidence that you need to try and like set up traps, then you're probably screwed anyway. The second thing is like I think a good thing to think about is have I by setting this debate to a particular country deprived the other team of any arguments? If the answer is yes, it's probably not legitimate. I mean, obviously at some margin you're going to be depriving them of arguments, but like, are most of the arguments they're going to run still be the same and just apply to this particular context? The last thing to note is it's almost never a good idea to set a topic, like set a motion in worlds format, because you need to be able to defend that place setting throughout the debate, and there's like substantial reason to suspect maybe that your closing government and maybe the closing opposition as well will just not really have a bar of the place setting, and your ability to fulfill your role as opening government by dictating the issues that the rest of the debate talks about is kind of like completely lost if instead it becomes like a more theoretical discussion or something like that to avoid your place set.
Given that statistically closing ops win, and Kami and I recently felt that wrath, how do you think as the opening opposition you should plan your strategy so not to be undermined or beaten?
Well, so that debate that you guys are talking about, yeah. So like, really briefly, like what happened there was, the opening government ran like the wrong principle. So this was the final at HWS. The motion was basically that candidates should be able to designate campaign promises that are legally binding and result in recall elections if they're broken. So the opening government, as their principle, it was just a misstep, like it was a mistake, said, we believe that candidates should have the right to take this risk. It just like didn't really make sense. Like the obvious kind of principle that you want to be getting at there is like what it means to have a democratic mandate, what it means to have a democracy dictated by single issue considerations, like something along those lines. And I think the opening up there, probably rather than delivering that principle yourselves, kind of stayed a bit in the paradigm that the opening government set up, which was like a largely practical paradigm, which let then the closing opposition have like quite a lengthy exposition about the nature of representative democracy and the nature of a mandate. So that was like a bit of a situation where you guys probably could have just like backfilled the mistakes the opening government had made to kind of shore up your position. All right, yeah.
A little bit more on place setting. I should ask this before. When do you not place set? Like, I was thinking of the poacher's motion when you first brought that up. Did you set that in a
No, I
specific
mean,
place,
like,
or did you just do
my
principles?
understanding, I mean, you know, there's rules about these things, but they're neither here nor there. Like, my understanding of the way you do things at Worlds is that the word "this house" in the motion specifically sets the motion at a level of generality. Like, you are talking, you know, in pretty general terms. So, for that debate, what you should use lots of are, like, illustrative examples. You know, you should frame the debate relatively broadly in terms of context, and then just, like, talk about all the examples. Yeah. And certainly one of the things that's important to think about is, if you're going to talk predominantly about one area, you need to justify that. So if that poaching motion, you were going to set it in the third world, that kind of makes sense. And you talk about that a lot. And then if your closing government wanted to run an extension about, like, the problems with, like, poaching in Australia, they would be totally within their rights to do so. But they'd have to explain to the judge why that was the most important area of the debate. Yeah.
Just to go back to my question, is it so you think the strategy is maybe just recognizing the right principles in the debate, not be undermined by the closing opposition in general? Not
yeah, I mean, like, you know, your strategy is to, like, not let mistakes that the opening government make dictate your course. So your job as opening opposition is not entirely to respond to the opening government. It's also to, like, lay out ideas and principles that maybe the opening government didn't think of. Okay, we might move to the closing half, if that makes sense. We've probably got, like, a reasonable amount of time for that now.
We have till 9.
Yeah, we have till 9. So that's, yeah, like 20 minutes. Yeah, okay, cool. Okay, so the closing half of the debate. Extensions. I think there are, obviously, I guess, like, there are degrees of difficulty to coming up with extensions, and there are different types of extensions in terms of what you want to do in the debate. The way that I explain what a closing team should do with their extension is that an extension has two parts. There is the threshold test of existence. Is there some new contribution to the debate? And then there is the secondary test that helps you win or come second, which is, have you explained why that new contribution you made to the debate is the most important issue of the debate, or helps your side win the debate, or helps your team win the debate. So it's really important to think when you're giving member speeches and when you're giving whip speeches that you're not just delivering content, you're delivering justification and argumentation in favour of the importance of that content. So explaining how your extension draws things together, or how your extension underlies all of those things. What you then want to do, I guess, in your 15 minutes and in the debate is, like, one of the easiest things is just, like, make a list of all the stakeholders and run an extension on the stakeholders that aren't touched by the opening half of the debate, or on the most important stakeholders that aren't touched. And what you need to be doing there is, like, devoting your energies not just to coming up with the arguments about those stakeholders, but also the justification of why they're important. So, for instance, in a debate, say, about domestic violence policy, a stakeholder that, like, might not be touched in the debate so far is healthcare workers. Say the motion is that we should mandatorily report all domestic violence to the police. You know, maybe the opening half is talking a lot about the criminal justice, about the victims and the perpetrators, but not about the healthcare system. The way in which you could run an extension on that stakeholder, so, you know, you have new arguments about how, you know, compulsory reporting will change the nature of the relationship between doctors and their patients to make that relationship more open because the matter's going to the police anyway. Like, who knows if that's actually the case, right? The second thing you then have to do is explain why that's the most important material in the debate. So what you might say is that, you know, that greater openness is crucial to actually securing the prosecutions that this motion aims to secure. Or it's crucial to making sure that victims can actually be treated and rehabilitated, which is the most important thing that this motion is trying to get at. So you're aware that there are those two halves there. And that is why I think teams sometimes, when they extend onto a stakeholder, can run into troubles, because they identify something that hasn't been talked about yet and they make an argument, but they can't show a way in which, you know, addressing and changing things for that stakeholder actually reflects back on the rest of the debate in a way that is, like, meaningful and debate-winning.
We've got about 20 minutes left. Is there...
there's probably a bit more on extensions, sorry.
Well, what I was just going to suggest is, like, if we could just get a sense of, like, stuff that people wanted to cover, so we could, like, if we'd be disappointed, and there'll obviously be stuff left over at the end of the debate. But if there's like stuff we're not even close to addressing that you have a question about, we might just make like a very quick list just so we can apportion time a bit more efficiently.
I don't know if it's possible to do, but maybe if there's a little bit of time, we could maybe see you guys like over here doing a prep or doing a certain one of the positions. I don't know if this is possible.
I reckon we might struggle.
Our theatrical skills as well are like not great.
Yeah,
it would actually, the problem is it would be like a bit disappointing because we've debated so much now that if we were opening government, I would like write my PM speech and Chris would like think of other ideas and then we'd come together at the end and just like check that we're on the same page.
Okay.
Which is like obviously not best practice.
So we'll just almost try and survey and get the list. Do you have something, or you just?
We're talking about questions on extensions.
Okay, well let's just stick with extensions.
Yeah. Okay. So,
well, we can go with extensions later.
Okay. I'm only going to be like there's only like one more thing I want to say about extensions. Anyway. The thing to think about that I guess is like a useful way of conceptualizing what you want to do with your extension is to think about whether you are going to extend back into the debate or extend away from or out of the debate. So, are you going to direct your extension back towards winning issues that have already been raised, which is a completely acceptable type of extension, and it's like probably the most common type of extension on the British circuit, or are you going to take your extension away from what's already been discussed, perhaps to a new stakeholder, or the other type is like a new perspective. So, you know, what does this mean for the third world? What does this mean from a feminist perspective? You know, those I guess are valid ways. Those impose different obligations. So if you're extending back into the debate, what you might do, for instance, is like take the principle that the opening government has expounded on and just do like a much better job of proving it such that you like actually prove it. When you extend back into the debate, you need to be like really scrupulous about outlining to the adjudicator how far it is you think the opening team got on proving that issue and how far you're taking the issue further beyond that. So you need to be very clear about, we think the opening government did a good job in proving X, Y, and Z, but in order for this, like, you know, what we're going to contribute to win this issue is, you know, A, B, and C. So you need to be very clear about that. If you're extending out of the debate, as I said, you need to be very clear about why that material is relevant and how it interacts with the rest of the debate in a way that's debate winning. Cool.
Okay, so we talked about a lot about the development of arguments. You can go into like the presentation of arguments in a speech. I know it may be second nature to you guys, like how you do it all the time, but what's the most effective way to present arguments?
It's probably a matter of taste. I would say, really generally, what you want to do is like identify a claim. So whether that claim is that individual rights trump group rights, or that this will make America a safer country, or whatever. Identify your claim, and then basically just like provide evidence or reasons to support that claim. There is, you know, nothing wrong, I think, with having like a pretty clear goal of your argument, and then just a list of reasons that go towards achieving it. So long as, you know, hopefully you order them in some way that is kind of logical. So, you know, maybe like a basic starting point, and then something that flows from that, and then maybe something that draws on the first two reasons. You know, hopefully other people can deliver arguments as like entire narratives, but one of the benefits of trying to keep your argument with what I would describe as like a linear trajectory is that you can be really sure that you're not repeating yourself and that your argument's not getting circular. I think people can get caught up in repeating themselves in situations where they have maybe a premise and an explanation and then try and link it back to the topic or link it back to the explanation, and it becomes a little bit circular. So I guess it's a really good idea when you're plotting out an argument to have a clear idea of, you know, where you want to start, you know, the premise or the claim that you want to make, and where you want to end, and exactly how you're going to get there. And having it as a list, whether or not you say the numbers out loud or not, is like a pretty good way of doing it, and I guess it is like pretty much how we would make any argument.
Yeah. What is it?
Yeah.
You briefly touched on the POIs a little bit, but you want to expand a little more on just the effective use of it during the round.
Yeah. Is any more questions on extensions or?
No, I have a POI-related question that kind of plays into that.
Okay. We'll save time for POIs.
This is sort of related to extensions, but more in terms of the whip. Like, how do you, as a whip, stand up and kind of incorporate your partner's extension, especially if it's of the second type, if your partner's extension is something that moved into a stakeholder analysis, or if it offered a new perspective, while still talking about the opening house's relevance and practical and good sound reasons. How do you make it seem as though your extension has trumped it if it's clearly like outside of something that they've talked about already?
Yeah, I've almost never spoken with because I'm not very good at it. So, but I think Steve is.
Basically, what you need to do there is, I mean, as a starting point, it's totally acceptable to structure a whip speech as like one issue is the opening half, one issue is the extension across from you, and one issue is your own extension. And you can even just say those are your issues. You don't even have to like give them special names. That's totally fine. Say you have an extension on a different stakeholder. What you might do is say, the first question I'm going to ask is, how would this mandatory reporting of domestic violence impact on the criminal justice system? And that was the preoccupation of the first half of the debate. The second question I'm going to ask is, is it a good idea to give the perpetrators of domestic violence a free ride in the way that the closing government wanted to suggest? The third question I'm going to ask is, why is it that by improving the relationship between victims and their doctors, we can solve a lot of the problems that the entire round was directed towards? Okay. So what you're doing as a whip is like being keenly aware that your job is probably much more justification of your extension than delivery of your extension. You want to defend your extension from attacks, obviously, but a lot of what you want to be doing is explaining those links. And one of the good ways of doing that is, especially if your whip speech isn't structured as just opening half, extension, extension, if it's structured along kind of questions in the debate, make the answer to each question your extension. So maybe the questions might be, how do we prosecute perpetrators of domestic violence? How do we protect the victims of domestic violence? How do we make sure the criminal justice system is fair to all parties? And the answer to each of them might be, you improve the relationship between doctors and their patients. So how do you improve the criminal justice system? You have better evidence that is like more fair to both sides by improving this doctor-patient relationship. How do you protect victims? By making sure that they can communicate with their doctors and that they will have to speak to their doctors because it's going to court anyway. Whatever, right? But it's really important to remember that your extension should feature as prominently as possible. And there's no reason why your extension can't also pop up in your discussion of the opening half if you're going to deal with that separately.
Can I jump back to the question that Corey asked a couple of minutes ago about how you make an argument? One of the points that I would say about that is that it's very easy to underestimate the power of rhetoric in this format, and that obviously some of you guys have formal study of rhetoric, but I probably don't see, having adjudicated it at 2 tournaments on this circuit now, probably don't see people I think reaping the benefits of having a very nice turn of phrase or some study of or some appreciation of the power of rhetoric. And when we were talking before about sort of that process of when you're researching, imagining how it would be used in the debate, I would imagine it down to the particular phrasing that you might use to make a point. And I think that if you have practiced in your head a way of rhetorically characterizing a particular situation, I think that is hugely beneficial for leaving and registering a real impression in the adjudicator's mind. And often you can have sort of slightly meaningless rhetoric being seemingly powerful during the debate. I mean, phrases like, the soft bigotry of low expectations. It's not particularly clear how that works. It registers, I think, an impression of persuasiveness that buttresses the analysis.
How good of a phrase is the audacity of hope, as opposed to any other descriptor you could put in front of the word hope? There is, as much as debating is a bit abstracted from reality, and you are debating about stuff that you're never going to put into practice, it's no reason why you should let yourself be rhetorically constrained. And you want to set yourself free from the fact that in reality you're debating in front of 7 other debaters and the adjudicator, and pretend there's an audience there. Pretend you're actually trying to persuade or turn a crowd or craft a speech, and just do that. Especially because then when you are actually debating in front of an audience, you'll reap the rewards.
We used to have this generic argument that we used to run, which was sort of borrowed from my history thesis, and it was applicable to almost any law enforcement debate, about how victims' rights were a stalking horse for state oppression, which was sort of just disputing the privilege that we would give to victims' voices in a debate about law enforcement and how that often actually that served to just create the conditions for a complete eradication of innocent people's rights. But yeah, I mean, just like, I think it's something I just wanted to bring up again to highlight, focus on.
Points of information, if we can...
Very quickly.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's on my topic.
Okay, points of information, really quickly. I guess...
We should get the question.
Well, just like one, I guess like one, sorry, just like one observation first. From having like, watch you guys debate a bit, I think there's a bit of a tendency on this circuit to ask points of information too much as hypothetical questions. So you're like gauging the other team's, reaction if some set of facts occurs in the debate. The problem with those kind of hypotheticals, especially when they're hypotheticals about like an analogy you're maybe going to raise, like how would your team react if everyone was red instead, like how would you react if Iran had 5 nuclear weapons? It's like really unclear what it's getting at, and it will be unclear what it's getting at to the other team. And it's like totally fine to respond to that by saying, I no doubt would react differently. I'm sure you'll explain in your speech why it's important. I'm not going to waste my time guessing. And just like get back to your material. And that's, what you need to be doing with points of information is like, within them, outlining enough facts that you make the question hard to answer. So a really good format for a point of information is just, given that, and then, some set of facts that is inconvenient to the other team, how is it that you justify why? Given that there are 35 million people in this country who have no access to health insurance at the moment and who are dying and crowding emergency rooms and making everything more expensive for us, how do you oppose requiring people to buy health insurance? Alright, questions on points of information? Yep.
How do you respond to a POI that's a good one and that totally catches you way off guard?
I guess that's...
Don't get caught off guard.
probably slowly is the first answer. As in, feel free to like take a breath, maybe not pause for ages, take a breath, collect your thoughts. It's always a good idea, if you can't think of anything else, to just like bluster back at the other team and try and maintain the illusion that you're on the offensive and that you're in control. So, the guy I debated with a lot, he'd get asked a point of information that would be like, well, sir, are you ever going to deal with our argument about the impact this has on families? And his response, if he like couldn't think of a response instantly, would be like, and are you ever going to respond to our argument about blah? It's like throw something back at them.
It's even just something else. That's absolutely absurd. Moving on. like that kind of thing.
Well, I noticed at HWS that I've been told by coaches and other people that it's commonly accepted to take like about 2 to 3 POIs during your speech, and I noticed that a lot of people didn't take any, and that really bothered me, and I didn't know if that was like a legitimate concern or if that should be like.
I don't think anyone expects you to take 3.
Yeah.
Generally you should take 2. It's legitimate to only take 1.
0 and 3 will almost lose you points from your speech.
That is conditional. On being offered enough. As in, I certainly saw speeches at that tournament where people didn't take a point of information. But it was generally like I generally didn't penalise them because they'd only been offered like a single point of information over the course of their speech. Yep. So I mean, and realistically, like teams should be offering at least like 3 or 4 points of information per speaker. And probably more than that, like at least like 5 points of information per speaker, which spread over a 6-minute or 5-minute window in which you can offer points of information. That's like 20 points of information. So the speaker should be given the opportunity, basically, to take the point of information at a juncture that suits them.
You mentioned earlier that as opening, you want to take questions, points of information from the back half because it helps you. On the back half, then, is it a good strategy just not to offer points of information or offer fewer points of information?
You never want to run away from the clash.
So then, now this is my next point. Is it a bad idea to preview your arguments in a point of information because that gives them the...
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, if you're in the closing half, unless you are offering them to whatever, but... Don't flag your extension. Just offer points of information that are attacks on things currently being said.
Yeah.
I think it might be helpful for like what you're just saying, like what you were talking about earlier today about your strategy with the red herring and the WUDC final with your POIs.
Yeah,
if you could like mention that again, I think it'll be helpful for understanding that.
I'm not sure how many of you guys have like watched our WUDC final. We're not offended. Basically, we had like the good luck of like coming up with, I guess, what we wanted to run as our extension, and also some other arguments in prep that weren't really raised by the opening op. And one of the things we did there was just like use some of the leftover ones as points of information as a way of kind of trying to keep the focus of the debate in areas that weren't our extension. And I guess the way of like putting that into practice in general is like if you can think of, I guess, new material that is really minor that you don't want to use in your extension, that's a great thing to bring up in points of information because it's like quite pithy and quick, and also because it hopefully will lure the opening team on your bench into talking about it a lot, or the other opening team into talking about it a lot.
I think the other thing is that if there's some very obvious arguments on the opposition side that are inevitably going to come out in the opening opposition case, then it helps to sort of laid your fingerprints on those arguments. So in the particular instance of the debate that Steve's talking about, the topic was something along the lines of like this house would show the full horror of war, and the point of information he's referencing is like the point of information we had about how offensive it would be to the victims of a soldier if the image of that soldier's death, or if that family's last image of their father was him swinging from a bridge, which is like, I guess, reinforcing these ideas of, and you know, we'd scripted that in prep, but the point reinforces the ideas of kind of like individual privacy or an individual's right to grieve in their own particular way, which inevitably is like going to be one of the central points of the opposition case, and as predicted came out in the open opposition case. But it helps diminish the uniqueness of their contribution if you've at least raised that point early.
Yeah, especially if like you can raise the point with an example that they don't use, or can raise it with like, I guess, like a rhetorical flourish that they don't have.
Okay, well, so I have a habit. I don't know if it's a bad habit or a good habit, but almost to help the speaker when I'm asking a POI. So, for instance, the speaker will maybe make like a really general argument, and then I'll get up there and be like, well, you need to prove in this instance why this is okay for whatever you're advocating.
Yeah.
That's bad.
It's just asking them to like make their argument in a better way.
Better way, yeah. I don't know if I get point for recognizing they're not doing something.
So that
wrong
is like that is what I would call like a challenge point of information. And what you want to do is take the skill of identifying the flaw in the argument and craft it into a question that hurts them. So instead of like, you need to tell us why it can actually be used in the United States, stand up and say, given that the United States has a fundamentally different relationship between the citizens and their government, doesn't it make sense that this won't work in the United States? So in other words, just like think for an extra 10 seconds before you offer the point of how to flip it around as, you know, as an attack that's hard for them to answer.
How do you use a point of information though that is kind of discrediting their argument without using a straw man fallacy?
If you had like a piece of evidence that completely disproved that point, is that what you're saying?
Do you mean that in the nature of asking a point of information is that you have to be reductivist about their argument, and therefore you might be attacking a straw man?
Right.
I guess like the thing to do is just like not do it. I mean, like, I know that's like not a very helpful answer, but as in, you know, try not to be misrepresenting them when you kind of, as you naturally have to do, reduce their argument a little bit, or make it very clear what the assumption about their argument you're making is. So, if you're arguing that X leads to Y, doesn't that fall down because of, you know?
Slightly different topic. How much do you think concessions can be strategic in debate? And if you think it's possible for them to be, how do you use them?
Okay, well, I mean, I'd say two things. First, points of information which are phrased along the lines of like, wouldn't you concede this, are very predictably answered by and inevitably someone is like, no, I wouldn't concede that because it would like destroy our case. That sounds incredibly damaging. So like, be aware that people are not ever prepared to like concede the argument and sort of just draw a line under the debate.
Conceding conceding an argument but the other team is.
In your speech.
And just in general,
Yeah.
not just on POIs.
Yeah, I reckon as a general rule, I coach at this weird high school where the kids are all like very bright and have this like annoying commitment to intellectual honesty, which leads them to do this kind of thing. Like an argument will be made that's like completely logically pure, and they'll be like, "Well, we concede this, but however, we think this other thing." You just have to adopt this attitude that the opposition are always wrong, and even on the rare occasion where you might be willing to concede that they're right, you shouldn't let it on to the adjudicator. Maybe a thing to do is to structure those things maybe as even if. So have an attempt at saying why it's wrong, and then say, assuming but not conceding that this argument is true, here's what we'd say. Yeah. I think assuming but not conceding is like a good way of saying even if, but while being like much clearer about it.
Maybe not with like conceding, but maybe like shared space with the argument, so that maybe you guys are arguing maybe similar principles that both teams accept, but your take on it.
We accept that the rights of the victim are important, but
not in this instance.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know we're kind of running out of time, but maybe to like wrap it up, because like you said you were like adjudicating some tournaments, so I was wondering like what you have like two close team, what makes a one, what makes a two?
I guess there's like many different factors. You'd look firstly at to what extent those teams engaged with each other, and if they were both in the same half of the debate, and one team did a lot more to engage with the substance and disproving the other's arguments, that will like instantly commend them. I think second, like you just like evaluate the quality of their contributions to the debate, what you thought were like the most important arguments.
One of the things that we've actually, I guess, like implied a lot here but forgotten to explicitly say is that if you're trying to beat a team, that has to be the team that you spend your attentions on beating. So in other words, say you're the closing opposition and the opening government really sucked, you don't spend your time kicking the opening government. You spend your time kicking the closing government and explaining why your material is new from the opening opposition. So I guess that's why Chris says if you're thinking between a 1 and a 2, you look at how those teams interacted. And if there were two good teams, but one has spent most of their time trying to win the debate from another team that's come third, they're less likely to win the round.
So we're out of time, but I want to ask one last question. You've been judging in the region, you've been working with debaters in the region, you've been debating all over the world, many different teams from England, Ireland, Europe, Australia, everywhere. How is this region in comparison to other regions of BP? How does it shake down?
Well, I think Steve nailed it this morning in your debate class when he said that it's a bit of a sleeping giant. I mean, I think that this region does the things that are hard to do well, and perhaps doesn't do some of the easy things as well. So just simply in terms of like rhetorical packaging of arguments, explicitly advertising the reasons why your team is winning a debate as compared to the other teams in a round, being prepared to sort of, I think, be a bit more aggressive on the pushback in terms of rebutting other teams' arguments, and then like finally. And perhaps this is something to improve on, is the amount of evidence that you would use to substantiate a claim. In that I think that at times the style of debating I've seen at the two tournaments I judged, and perhaps even some of the more informal things, is a little bit abstracted from reality. You have to remember that debating, even though it is a very artificial construct, is at its heart about real issues and real people. And I think the more that you can convey a message which appeals to those two things, like real consequential issues that affect real people in lots of different ways, then I think the better your debating will become.
All right, please join me in thanking them for...